Shortly after it opened, Black Tuesday wiped out some $14 billion from the New York Stock Exchange, which would be $199 billion in today's money, decimating a wide swath of U.S. industries, from housing to manufacturing. Impoverished families were unable to buy homes, so throughout the 30s, Brooklyn saw a major downturn in residential construction, which eventually led to extreme housing shortages after World War II, one of the prime factors for the suburbanization of New York in the 1950s, which again reduced demand for construction in Brooklyn. Thus, post-1930, Brooklyn's skyline would stay largely the same for decades, with its newest and tallest buildings all sharing a unified Art Deco style. The Bank Tower would remain Brooklyn's tallest building for the next 80 years. Even before the stock market crash, there were signs that the Roaring Twenties were grinding to a hoarse whisper. The decade's artistic byword was modernism, a celebration of all things new and untraditional. But the movement splintered as the 30s rolled in and political concerns began to trump stylistic ones. In literature, modernism had largely been supported and spread by a host of little magazines, which published and employed the likes of Hart Crane, Marianne Moore, John Dos Passos, T.S. Eliot, E.E. Cummings, Ezra Pound, and Amy Lowell, girlfriend of the actress Ada Dwyer. Few of these publications survived the 20s, and even most of the holdouts didn't last through the first years of the Great Depression. The Little Review, Secession, Broom, Contact, and The Dial had all stopped publishing by the time the stock market crashed. Pagany, Hound and Horn, and This Quarter folded soon after. Of those magazines, The Dial was arguably the most famous and most important. When it published its last issue in July 1929, it was eulogized in newspapers from Minneapolis to Nashville. One reporter wrote upon its passing, "Brilliant editors gathered some of the finest thought of the period in its pages. It will be necessary for most of us to subscribe to 3 magazines to replace it." During the last 5 years of its existence, The Dial was almost entirely steered by one brilliant yet unassuming woman and her mother, the poet Marianne Moore. Within a few months of The Dial's demise, Moore would leave Greenwich Village for an apartment at 260 Cumberland Street in Brooklyn, where she would live for the next 36 years. Red-headed and slight, Moore stood 5 feet 4 inches and at times weighed less than 80 pounds. Yet she was one of the lions of modernism, a bold writer, a tough editor, and a scintillating conversationalist, despite her reflexive modesty. T.S. Eliot called her one of those few who have done the language some service in my lifetime. Aside from poetry, she also wrote book reviews, translations, essays, a novel, a play, and the liner notes for Muhammad Ali's 1963 spoken word album, I Am the Greatest. Before her death in 1972, Moore won nearly every imaginable writing award, including the Pulitzer, the National Book Award, the Robert Frost Medal, a Guggenheim Fellowship, the Bollingen Prize, and over a dozen honorary degrees. For queer historians, Moore's life provides a wealth of information that adds up to no definitive conclusions. Hart Crane's nickname for her, the Right Reverend Miss Mountjoy, was a jab at her austere life and sexless public persona. Moore had no known sexual or romantic relationships as an adult, and lived with her mother, often sharing a bed, for almost her entire life. Indeed, had the labels been available to her, Moore might well have identified as asexual or aromantic, since most of her recorded thoughts about sex, marriage, and children range from modest disavowal to downright repugnance. According to biographer Linda Level, Marianne showed no more sexual interest in women than she did in men. In her poetry, never does she long for a lover's embrace. She comes to distrust unifying metaphor as much as she does romantic love. However, despite the enduring mystery of her own sexual desires, or disinterests, what is inarguable is that Moore lived the vast majority of her long life in a queer milieu, and that her home in Brooklyn hosted some of the most famous queer artists of the mid-20th century. Moore may well be the first prominent American to have been largely raised by a queer couple. Moore's father was institutionalized with schizophrenia in 1887, right before Moore was born. When Moore was 13, in 1900, her mother Mary began the most significant relationship of her life, with a woman named Mary Norcross. Norcross was the youngest daughter of the Moore's neighbors in Carlisle, Pennsylvania. When Mary Moore and Mary Norcross met, Norcross was 25, a fresh-faced graduate of Bryn Mawr who tended to wear old-fashioned brown petticoats.